Well, hello there, dear listeners. What a lovely forehead slope you have. Okay, so welcome to this primer episode for the upcoming panel on race science, where I'll actually have experts on to talk about this subject. Content warning, of course, because as you probably noted from the title, we're about to hear some incredibly racist people saying some incredibly racist things and making very poor excuses for their racist views. I had intended for this to be a quick 5 to 10 minute intro that I'd add to the panel itself, but as I went looking for clips, there were just too many good ones that I really wanted you to hear before going into that actual conversation, just to give you a little more context and background, so I decided to make this its own little episode. This way you'll get a real feel for the topic before that main conversation. Remember, I'm no scientist, so definitely not an expert in that regard. But I am someone who's watched these terrible people online for a very long time, especially those who provide intellectual cover for far-right talking points. And race and IQ just happens to be a favorite in those parts. So, yeah, my experience with this subject is mostly via the intellectual dark web types. Like Sam Harris and, of course, Charles Murray, whom he had a hand in rehabilitating, championing, and mainstreaming in recent years.
So many of the topics I discussed in the podcast with Murray are not topics I would ordinarily think about or recommend that you think about. But the purpose of the podcast was to set the record straight, because I find the dishonesty and hypocrisy and moral cowardice of Murray's critics shocking. And the fact that I was taken in by this defamation of him. So it is with real pleasure and some trepidation that I bring you a very controversial conversation on points about which there is virtually no scientific controversy. And it's with a man who could not have been a more genial and well-spoken guest. Meet Charles Murray. I mean, for anyone paying attention, I think it should be obvious, with a modicum of charity extended to us, that Murray and I are not racist, and that what we were saying was not coming from a place of racial animus.
My I'm not a racist t-shirt sure has people asking a lot of questions already answered by my t-shirt. Anyway, then there was Dave Rubin, who tried to normalize Stefan Molyneux, who was once known as a creepy, culty, far-right atheist YouTuber, but is now a well-known, fully out white nationalist. So looking back on Rubin's episode with him for this project was quite a trip, because who would have thought when they sat there together discussing how black people's brains are smaller than white people's brains? I mean, you'd think it was some silly caricature of race science fans, but no, this is literally what they were talking about.
Even if we say it's 100% environmental, it's still a fact at the moment. Even if we say, well...
But is there evidence that it's genetic?
Yes.
I'm not a geneticist.
Yes.
Genetic in what regard? I mean, if we took the brain of a 25-year-old black man and the brain of a 25-year-old white man, what is it that they're doing that...
Different sizes.
Yeah.
And again, this is dependent on every ethnicity, the higher IQ in general. There's lots of exceptions and so on. I don't know, the word Oriental's kind of come out of favor, which is kind of annoying in a way, because how do you differentiate people from India, people from East Asians, whatever, the Chinese, Japanese, and so on? 103, 104, 105 IQ in general, very high on spatial reasoning, which is why, software engineers, other kinds of engineers, you see that, like Google has this, it's like 40% or something like that of their engineers are
not
East
much
Asian.
more, because after this diversity thing goes through, they're going to just have to pick everybody by color and all that.
I have these positions, but they're based on reason and evidence, and I don't lose if somebody teaches me something better. I win, right? I mean, if you go in the wrong way and you stop someone and say, oh, you got to go the other way, you don't say, you're contradicting me, you bastard. And you say, well, good, now I get to go where I want to go. But we have to have those objective standards. And back to where we started, Dave, we have atheists who are not, I think, focusing as hard as they could on bringing forward these objective standards. Atheists, again, should be all over the race and IQ stuff, because because that's science as far as we know it at the moment, but they don't, and I think social conflicts escalate thereby.
Yeah.
Who could have imagined this guy would be known for his blatant white nationalism in the near future? Well, a lot of people did, and raised their objections about platforming such people, but of course they were dismissed as SJW, politically correct, woke scolds, or whatever the preferred interchangeable right-wing buzzword was in that era. Since Molyneux is now recognized as a full out-and-out white nationalist, it was interesting to revisit his conversation with Dave Rubin from 2017, which Rubin quietly changed the thumbnail of, mind you. It used to say race and IQ, but now it just says controversies. Anyway, it was amusing to hear that at that point, Molyneux was still pretending he thought racism was bad. And it was just such a difficult truth to grapple with, that white people are just innately, genetically smarter than black people.
But I found almost nothing harder to absorb than this question of differences in IQ between groups. And this goes back many, many decades. This was talked about by Herrnstein in Murray, of course, in the bell curve in 94. And nobody's been able to overturn that. And their basic argument is to say, look, blacks make less money than Ashkenazi Jews. But if you normalize by IQ, they don't. And this is, again, it's heartbreaking stuff. And it is so difficult to absorb this into your daily thinking. It's a very difficult, unpleasant, challenging phenomenon when we have different IQs, and we haven't even talked about male-female, which again is a whole other challenge to sort of absorb and understand. But and it's funny because the left is always complaining about, and I'm neither left nor right, but the left is always saying anti-science, people are anti-science and so on. This is science. IQ is a very, very good measure. It's one of the few metrics in the social sciences that is, measurable, empirical. It's predictable, right? I mean, if people's IQ was wildly different from where they ended up in life, then it would be less valid. But it's very close. It's a very close correlation to where people end up, and nobody knows how to change disparate IQs.
This pretense of it being so difficult is a theme that comes up in all these race science fans, from Charles Murray to Sam Harris and every skull measurer in between. They all seem to put on this act like it's just so unpleasant for them to have to do this or talk about these quote-unquote inconvenient truths, but they're just so devoted to science and data that they simply cannot ignore the facts, difficult and heartbreaking as they may be.
You don't realize when you keep saying that everybody else is thinking tribally, but you're not, that is our disagreement.
Well, no, because I know I'm not thinking tribally in this respect.
Well, that is our disagreement.
No, because I share your political biases there. Like I would line up with you completely. If I gave in to my bias, my social bias, I would become. I can't tell you what a relief it would be. To recognize that Nisbet and Turkheimer are reasoning better than anyone else in this field. I can't tell you what a relief it would be to realize that Gould's book, The Mismeasure of Man, was right on the money.
I don't think it would be a relief to you at all, because the thing that you said when you brought on, and I feel like now we're just getting back to the beginning, and we should let this go, and I'll let you have the last word after this. But right at the beginning of all this with Murray, you said you look at Murray and you see what happens to you. You were completely straightforward about that. That you look at what happens to him and you see what happens to you.
It's not tribalism.
I think the relief to you. I think look, we all have a lot of different identities. We're part of it all times. I do too, right? I have all kinds of identities that you can call forward. All of them can bias me simultaneously. And the questions, of course, are which dominate and how am I able to counterbalance them through my process of information gathering and adjudication of that information. But I think that your core identity in this is as someone who feels you get treated unfairly by politically correct mobs. And
but that's you're playing. That is not identity politics. That is my experience as a public intellectual trying to talk about ideas.
That I will say this. That is what folks from the dominant group get to do. They get to say, my thing isn't identity politics, only yours is. I will tell you, Sam, when people who do not look like you hear you telling them that this is just identity politics, they don't think, God, he's right. That is just identity politics. They think this is my experience and you don't understand it.
It's just that you have to be paying attention to this in order to defend yourself against charges of racism. I don't want to say another word about IQ and race for the rest of my life, I can assure you. I don't want to say another word about IQ and race for the rest of my life, I can assure you. But now I'm doing this podcast, and I'm going to be doing a podcast with Ezra Klein to take his foot out of my mouth. I mean, that's what's so asymmetrical about this situation. In order to prove you're not a racist here, you have to prove that you have made a good faith interpretation of the science. And then you're talking about what he calls racialist science or race science. And you are one of these toxic people who is guilty of even paying attention to this stuff. This is a no-win situation.
These conversations about group IQs often lead to slimy, gross discussions about criminality and race. If you listen to my mini-series on Sam Harris, Woken Up, you will be quite familiar with that awful stuff too. If not, I will link it in the show notes and you can check it out.
Does the killing of George Floyd prove that we have a problem of racism in the United States? Does it even suggest that we have a problem of racism in the United States? The police use more deadly force against white people.
I had to revisit this just a couple of years ago after the Black Lives Matter thing. And the most recent book I wrote was called Facing Reality. And it was two truths about race in America and having to do with crime rates and having to do with IQ. And the reason I felt compelled to do that was it is not the case that thousands of black men are being shot by cops at random. In fact, the numbers are, you're talking very small numbers. And if they say, oh, but more blacks are shot than whites, people have got to come to grips with the fact that the people who are committing the crimes, there's a racial differential.
Anyway, this stuff goes hand in hand with blatant and incessant racism denial. These types of guys would rather do all sorts of mental gymnastics to pretend that things like systemic racism barely or simply don't exist. And instead, they attribute those problems and injustice and asymmetry in society to group IQs, causing a difference in outcomes.
It is probably fair to say this is the most controversial book in the last 50 years. And the book looks at the growing role that intelligence plays in modern societies. And the authors worry about a kind of cognitive partitioning of our society into separate classes. I mean, there was a time when being a few standard deviations above the mean in intelligence didn't get you very much when you're just plowing the field alongside your neighbors. But now you can start a software company or a hedge fund.
Oh yeah, we certainly live in a society that purely rewards intelligence. It's so obvious that these fashy tech bros are billionaires just because of their extremely high IQs. And I mean, there's also Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson, just peak human intelligence, translating to massive success worldwide. That's all it is. It's just, brain size and IQ. These race science guys often act like these are forbidden subjects that they are tackling at great personal cost, with absolutely no desire to do so other than their completely non-ideological, dispassionate dedication to empirical data. It is only this elite group of truth tellers that holds this secret knowledge the world is constantly silencing them on. and they continue to frame it as taboo or unspeakable, regardless of how many large platforms they have to air their views on said topics, or how many podcasts, they dedicate to it. Just the most basic, far-right grifter formula, again and again and again. Bet you'll never guess what Sam Harris's episode with Charles Murray was titled. That's right. Forbidden Knowledge. It's actually fascinating how often they dwell on the fact that they are so reluctant to discuss any of this at all. They're just being made to, because either everyone else is too woke, hysterical, irrational, and too afraid to face the quote-unquote facts, or they're being smeared and slandered by evil leftists who lie about data and force it to fit their politically correct views. And so these heroes must continue to discuss race and IQ to defend their own reputations, and therefore must do it over and over and over and over again. These poor guys are being slandered for simply paying attention to this stuff at all, not because they're spreading racist junk science or anything. It's the wokes that are unable to cope with the truth.
In the process of defending him against the charge of racism, and in order to show that he had been mistreated for decades, we had to talk about the science of IQ and the way genes and environment almost certainly contribute to it. And again, IQ is not one of my concerns, and racial differences in IQ is absolutely not one of my concerns. IQ is not one of my concerns, and racial differences in IQ is absolutely not one of my concerns. But a person having his reputation destroyed for honestly discussing data, that deeply concerns me. And I had heard at that point from many prominent scientists who fully agreed that Murray had been treated despicably, but who didn't have the courage to say so publicly. And that bothered me. Literally every scientist I spoke with before my podcast with Murray felt that a grave injustice had been done in his case. So I had him on the podcast. And as I said, in order to demonstrate that he's not a malicious charlatan and racist, I had to run through the science to some degree. Again, the science that Klein calls race science or racialist pseudoscience. The science that he says is America's most ancient justification for bigotry and racial inequality. What you have in me is someone who shares most of your political concerns and yet is unwilling to, again, a loaded word, lie about what is and is not a good reading of empirical data, and what is and is not a good argument about genetics and environment and and what is reasonable to presume based on what we already know.
They do it for science. In fact, they say we can't hide from such science-y, truthy truths, even if we want to, because we will just continue to be inundated by these fact bombs as research on humans progresses. It's just right around the corner, and we will all see just how right they all are and how wrong the wokes are.
And again, the problem is that even if we never look for these things again, even if we follow this taboo and decide that there's no ethical reason to ever look at population differences, we will be continually ambushed by these data. They're just going to spring out of our study of intelligence generically, or human genetics generically. It's happened on other topics already, and people try to keep quiet about it because, again, the environment journalistically and politically is so charged. But the problem is that the data on population differences will continue to emerge whether we're looking for it or not. And the idea that one should lie about these data or pretend to be convinced by bad arguments that are politically correct, or worse, that it's okay to malign people or even destroy their reputations if they won't pretend to be convinced by bad arguments, that's a disaster. Morally and politically and intellectually, that is a disaster, and that's where we are.
It's such a predictable and silly song and dance routine. If you know what to look for, you can spot it a mile away. It really seems that people like Harris are so ideologically blinded by their preconceived views that they simply will not engage with the many, many flaws pointed out in the data or the criticisms brought up by so many academics and scientists. They would rather hide behind, "It's not me that's wrong. Everyone else is simply too hysterical to handle the truth." And they really lean heavily into maintaining that plausible deniability, that guise of scientific respectability. So everything is shrouded in vagueness and comes with endless caveats, so you can't precisely pin them to the slimy position they seem to be claiming. They make sure to leave that wiggle room to walk it back. They'll acknowledge environmental factors while simultaneously making every effort to downplay them.
Nothing's 100% heritable, so the role for the environment is always there. It's always important. People don't want to hear that a person's intelligence is in large measure due to his or her genes, and there seems to be very little we can do environmentally to increase a person's intelligence, even in childhood. It's not that the environment doesn't matter, but genes appear to be 50 to 80% of the story. People don't want to hear this.
In terms of the history, you're looking at this reduction that occurred 30, 40 years ago, and then you look at a very flat set of test results since then. Basically, for tests administered to people born since about 1973, the black-white difference has been virtually unchanging, with a lot of tests giving that result. You have a genetic component to the black-white difference, you have an environmental component, and the big improvement in the environment had pretty much occurred by the end of the 1960s, the early 1970s, and what we are looking at subsequently is the remaining genetic component, which is intact.
And there are a lot of qualifiers, like the IQ test is reasonably at predicting certain things.
Suppose that you have a set of test scores. You can complain all you want to about whether these are really measuring intelligence. Okay. What you cannot argue with, and this is the empirical reality that people have to deal with, is you give me those test scores. I'm not going to try to defend their construct validity in some theoretical sense. I'm just going to say, if I'm an employer hiring people, I can use those test scores to make reasonably good guesses, about how those employees will perform. I can use those test scores if I am running a university to have a pretty good prediction of how students will do in the classroom.
Or things like, sure, there may be errors in scholarship, but that's definitely not why the campus commies are burning Murray at the stake.
So what happened to Murray, as far as I can tell, has had nothing to do with errors of scholarship, of which undoubtedly there must be some. Or for the way he's conducted himself since, or for his personal motives for discussing these topics in the first place. Rather, his scapegoating has been entirely the result of his having merely discussed differences in human intelligence at all.
They will simultaneously accept there are flaws, but also claim there's simply nothing in psychological science with more evidence than these claims.
Now, unfortunately for Murray, what we have here is a set of nested taboos. Human intelligence itself is a taboo topic. People don't want to hear that intelligence is a real thing, and that some people have more of it than others. They don't want to hear that IQ tests really measure it. They don't want to hear that differences in IQ matter, because they're highly predictive of differential success in life. And not just for things like educational attainment and wealth, but for things like out-of-wedlock birth and mortality. And they certainly don't want to hear that average IQ differs across races and ethnic groups. Now, for better or worse, these are all facts. In fact, there is almost nothing in psychological science for which there is more evidence than these claims. In fact, there is almost nothing in psychological science for which there is more evidence than these claims. About IQ, about the validity of testing for it, about its importance in the real world, about its heritability, and about its differential expression in different populations. Again, this is what a dispassionate look at decades of research suggests. This is what a dispassionate look at decades of research suggests. Unfortunately, the controversy over the bell curve did not result from legitimate, good faith criticisms of its major claims. Rather, it was the product of a politically correct moral panic that totally engulfed Murray's career and has yet to release him. His co-author, Richard Herrnstein, died just before the book was published, so Murray weathered the storm alone, and it rages to this day.
But then retreat to, of course there are exceptions, and of course we must still treat everyone as individuals, regardless of group IQs. Why would you think that is racist? You're the real racist for thinking that.
So we got to chapter 13. I thought Dick Herrnstein, my co-author, and I did a beautiful job on that chapter. I thought we said to the reader, people run screaming from the room if you talk about black and white differences in IQ, and actually there's no reason to do that. You can look at all the facts squarely in the face, and this is not something that should cause you to lose sleep at night. It's not a big deal.
Why is it not a big deal?
Because you judge other people as individuals, not as members of groups.
We want everyone to have as much opportunity as they can have. That is all understandable. But distorting and cherry-picking the science and slandering anyone who won't succumb to your level of confirmation bias as a racist is totally unethical. That's not good faith criticism. This is one side of a scientific debate smearing the other side with the most toxic moral and intellectual aspersions possible. These are reputation-destroying slanders.
There's also this bizarre move where they fixate on athletic ability as some sort of gotcha, pointing out that there are certain groups represented more than white people in certain sports. And sometimes it leads them to very bizarre and awful places, like when Harris was hypothesizing about a Jewish hoarding gene. Fucking hell. Or comparing very valid concerns about race science, which has been used throughout history to do serious harm, to absurd hypotheticals.
But that's the kind of thing that could just emerge from, the study of hoarding behavior. If someone studies the psychological problem of hoarding and they study the genetics of it, and then they just happen to discover that the genetics are represented differently in different populations, and Ashkenazi Jews, of which half of my ancestry is, have more of the hoarding genes than other people. Do we deal with that like adults, or do we vilify the person who merely spoke about the data? That's the bright line I'm trying to get you to acknowledge. 99.99% level. Right? This is just something you will see by virtue of statistics. And therefore, that is the kind of thing, a shifting of the mean in a specific ability, relevant to track and field in this case, could explain why you just see this massive overrepresentation of West Africans in the 100-meter final. You just see this massive overrepresentation of West Africans in the 100-meter final. Okay? It would be possible to be so paranoid about anti-Semitism and to be so disinterested about a biological understanding of human difference, or to think that any biological understanding of human difference is so intrinsically toxic that it can't be discussed. So that two Jews like us could be worried that anti-Semitism is the explanation for why Jews aren't represented there. And I take Andrew to be saying there that would be nuts, frankly. And I think we both know in our gut it would be nuts. And yet we're in danger of doing that elsewhere. And I think this is Murray's concern. He's worried about
attributions of racism where racism doesn't in fact exist, and that we are ill-prepared to study and correct for the consequences of human difference. And I can tell you, we're not going to get rid of human difference until we've all just uploaded ourselves into the matrix, right? So there will be differences that we're continually trying to correct for. And all we have is intellectual honesty and ethical goodwill as tools to do that.
What is the analogy you're drawing exactly?
So this is to rehabilitate the statement that Andrew made in his piece that you cast off as being somehow ethically or politically deranged. The idea that understanding the facts of genetics, in this case, might inoculate us against false charges of bigotry, like seeing bigotry where it doesn't exist, right? And in this case, if we as two Jews I'm
sorry, I just want to make sure I understand what you're saying here. Are you comparing the idea that there are not Jews in the finals of the New York City or Boston Marathon or whatever to the idea, to the conversation about whether African Americans, after what has gone on in this country's history,
I'm trying to
scoring worse than IQ?
I'm trying to.
I want to make sure I'm understanding what you're saying.
No, it sounds like you want to try to give some politically correct slam dunk.
You call it politically correct, but I'm actually you're bringing up in this conversation. I didn't make you do this.
You didn't.
You talk about race and IQ.
It's a point that clarifies. Yeah. I'm trying to sharpen up Andrew's point that you seem to not see the point of. Is that if you go looking for bigotry as your explanation for every difference you see,
I don't think there's been a white winner of the 100-yard dash in the Olympics for a zillion years. Not quite literally that, but close.
So, yeah, that about sums up my general experience with this topic. And as a non-scientist and non-academic, I, unfortunately, am probably more familiar with these awful internet subcultures pretending to be rational than anyone should be unless they're studying these things. But I thought, it'd be good to actually have a bunch of scientists and academic types on to give us some history on the topic and to talk about how this stuff continues to be legitimized in academia, continues to be cited, and also to talk about just how deeply, deeply flawed the data all this modern day skull measuring rests upon is. It's worse than you think. Like, way worse. So make sure you tune in next time. I'll have all 3 parts up early on Patreon. So if you'd like to hear it all now and support this little show, please subscribe via patreon.com/nicemangoes. Do it for science.
Because it's simply a fact that defending the claims that Murray made sounds racist to many, many people. And it sounds, above all, that one cares about racial differences, which I don't.